I grew up in a house that looked like it belonged in a luxury magazine. My parents, Daniel and Eleanor, were the kind of people who curated every aspect of their lives for perfection. My father, a financial consultant, treated success like a religion, and my mother, ever the graceful homemaker, made sure our family's reputation sparkled just as much as our pristine home. We lived in an elegant two-story house in an upscale neighborhood, where the lawns were perfectly trimmed and the driveways gleamed with luxury cars. Our home was decorated with expensive furniture, our walls lined with carefully chosen portraits meant to portray a family that was effortlessly successful. And for most of my life, I played my part. I was the straight-A student, the daughter they paraded around at their elegant dinner parties. "Claire is going to an Ivy League school," my mother would announce, swirling her wine, while my father nodded with a satisfied smirk. It wasn't a goal, it was an expectation. Family dinners in our household were less about bonding and more about performance reviews. My father discussed the stock market, my mother her latest charity work, and then came my turn. I had to deliver good news, academic awards, high test scores, another extracurricular I'd conquered. Anything less was met with a cold, silent disappointment that cut deeper than any punishment. "Success is our family's tradition, Claire," my mother would say, her voice smooth but laced with unspoken pressure. "You have no choice but to uphold it." I believed them. I believed that my worth was tied to my achievements, that love had to be earned, and that failure was a stain I could never afford. But even in that perfect house, something didn't feel right. A small crack had begun to form, an uneasy whisper at the back of my mind. And soon enough, that crack would shatter everything. From the outside, my life seemed effortless, but inside, I was suffocating under the weight of my parents' expectations. My schedule was meticulously planned: advanced placement classes, SAT prep courses, music lessons, leadership programs. Every hour of my day accounted for, every activity chosen with one goal in mind: getting me into an elite university. I rarely had time for friends. My parents saw socializing as a distraction unless it involved networking with the right kind of people. My mother had a particular disdain for my childhood best friend, Sarah, whose parents weren't wealthy enough to be considered suitable company. The only friendships she approved of were the ones that could serve a greater purpose, a connection that could be useful someday. At school, I excelled because I had to. Failure wasn't an option. If I brought home anything less than an A, my father wouldn't yell. He didn't have to. His disappointment was silent, sharp, lingering. A tight-lipped glance at my mother, a slow shake of the head, and that was enough to make me feel like I had personally failed the entire family. By the time I reached my final year of high school, the pressure was unbearable. I had worked myself to exhaustion, chasing a dream that wasn't even mine. The dream belonged to them, to my parents, who had built their lives around the idea that their daughter would be a shining example of their success. But the problem with living under constant pressure is that cracks inevitably start to form. And no matter how much you try to hold everything together, eventually, something breaks. And for me, that break was coming sooner than I could have ever imagined. By my final semester of high school, exhaustion was my constant companion. I had spent years shaping myself into the daughter my parents wanted, meticulously perfect, unshakably disciplined, and entirely focused on the one goal they had set for me: getting into an elite university. My days were a blur of study sessions, extracurricular meetings, and carefully crafted essays meant to impress admissions boards. I barely slept. The weight of their expectations pressed down on me, whispering that anything less than perfection meant failure, not just for me, but for them. But beneath the surface, something inside me was beginning to fray. I had no idea what I wanted for myself. My interests, my passions, none of it mattered. My life had been laid out before me like a meticulously paved road, and I was expected to walk it without question. But the more I tried to force myself to want what they wanted, the more lost I felt. Sarah, my only real friend, had started noticing. "You need to slow down," she said one evening as we sat in her car, parked outside my house. "I mean it, Claire. You look like you're about to break." I let out a hollow laugh. "I don't have time to break." She frowned. "But do you even want this?" The Ivy League, the business degree, all of it. I hesitated. The truth was, I didn't know. I had never been given the space to figure that out. Before I could answer, my phone buzzed. A message from my mother. Come inside. It's late. That was my cue. I gave Sarah a weak smile, promising I'd be fine, and stepped out of the car. But as I walked up the perfectly manicured driveway to my perfectly structured life, a sinking feeling settled in my chest. Something was coming. And deep down, I already knew, this life I had spent years sacrificing for wasn't mine at all. The letter arrived on a cold Thursday afternoon. A single envelope sitting on the kitchen counter, pristine and heavy with the weight of my entire future. My mother had already brought it inside, placing it where I couldn't ignore it. I held my breath as I tore it open, my fingers trembling. Dear Miss Harrington, it began. We regret to inform you. The words blurred. My vision tunneled. Rejected. I had done everything. The grades, the test scores, the extracurriculars. I had sacrificed friendships, sleep, my sanity. And it hadn't been enough. I barely noticed my mother walking in, her silk blouse crisp, her expression unreadable as she took in the letter clutched in my shaking hands. Claire? Her voice was sharp. What is it? I couldn't speak. I just held the letter out to her. She snatched it from my grasp, scanning the words, her lips pressing into a thin line. When she finally looked up at me, there was no sympathy. Just cold, burning disappointment. This must be a mistake. I felt something crack inside me. It's not. The air between us tensed like a drawn bowstring. Footsteps echoed down the hall, my father. He walked in, his presence always demanding, always suffocating. Eleanor, what's going on? My mother handed him the letter without a word. I watched as he read it, his expression darkening with every second. And then he exhaled slowly, pinching the bridge of his nose. How did this happen? I don't know, I whispered. His eyes flicked to mine, and for the first time in my life, I saw something worse than disappointment in them. I saw disgust. We did everything for you, my mother hissed. All the tutors, the programs. We built your entire life around this, Claire. I opened my mouth, but no words came out. I had nothing to say. This is unacceptable. My father's voice was cold, final. You've embarrassed us. I felt like I couldn't breathe. Get out. The words knocked the air from my lungs. What? My mother crossed her arms. You have no future here. We can't support failure. I stared at them, waiting for the punchline. Waiting for some hint that this was just another one of their cruel lessons. But there was nothing. Just silence. They weren't joking. Panic clawed at my throat. Where am I supposed to go? That's not our concern anymore. My father turned away as if I were already gone. You're not our daughter if you can't even bring honor to this family. And just like that, it was over. 20 minutes later, I was standing outside with a single suitcase, the cold wind biting through my thin sweater. The house I had lived in my entire life loomed behind me, its doors shut, its windows glowing with warmth I was no longer welcome in. I had nothing. No plan. No place to go. And as I took my first steps away from the home that had never really been mine, one thought burned in my mind, cutting through the numbness. They would regret this. I would make sure of it. I stood outside my childhood home, gripping the handle of my suitcase so tightly my knuckles turned white. The cold wind stung my cheeks, but nothing compared to the raw humiliation burning in my chest. My parents had shut the door on me without a second thought, as if I was just another failed investment, an embarrassment to be discarded. I had nowhere to go. With shaking hands, I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts. The first name that came to mind was Sarah. My only real friend. My only chance. The phone rang twice before she picked up. Claire? I swallowed the lump in my throat. Hey. I need somewhere to stay. Just for a night or two. Silence stretched between us. I could hear the muffled sounds of her family in the background, plates clinking, laughter, warmth. The kind of home I had never really had. Finally, she sighed. Come over. I'll leave the door unlocked. Relief flooded through me. Thank you. I started walking, the wheels of my suitcase rattling against the pavement. Sarah only lived a few blocks away, but the distance felt endless. Every step carried the weight of my parents' rejection, the brutal realization that I truly had nothing. Sarah let me crash on her couch that night. She didn't ask questions, but I saw the pity in her eyes. It made my stomach turn. "You can stay as long as you need," she said softly. I nodded, but I knew I couldn't stay long. Her parents were kind, but they had their own problems, their own bills to pay. I couldn't be a burden. The next day, I packed my things before she woke up and sent her a thank you text before slipping out the door. And so began my spiral. I bounced from couch to couch, crashing with friends who could spare the space for a night or two. Some let me stay out of kindness, others out of curiosity, wanting to hear the full, sordid story of how Claire Harrington, the golden child, had fallen from grace. I never gave them the satisfaction. By the end of the week, I was out of options. The invitations dried up, the sympathy wore thin. No one wanted a permanent guest. I sat on a park bench that night, my last few dollars spent on a stale sandwich from a gas station. My phone battery was almost dead. My clothes were wrinkled, my body aching from too many nights curled up on floors and couches. I had never felt so small, so disposable. And yet, through the exhaustion, through the sheer hopelessness of it all, one thought kept me going. I would make them regret this. I wasn't done. Not by a long shot. By the time I found myself in the back of a 24-hour diner nursing a cup of cheap coffee, I had stopped feeling sorry for myself. The shock had worn off, replaced by a dull, simmering rage that kept me awake at night. My parents had cast me aside like I was nothing. My so-called friends had let me drift away without much concern. The life I had spent years building was gone. But if there was one thing I knew for certain, it was this: I wasn't going to beg. The diner was nearly empty, save for a few night owls and a guy sitting a few booths away, sketching in a tattered notebook. His hair was slightly messy, his hoodie worn at the edges. He looked like someone who had spent just as many sleepless nights as I had. I didn't notice him watching me until he spoke. "Rough night." I glanced up, meeting his eyes. They were sharp, calculating, but not unkind. "You could say that," I muttered. He smirked, tapping his pen against the table. "You look like someone with a plan. Or at least someone who needs one." I scoffed. "And you look like someone who thinks they have answers." He shrugged. "Maybe I do." His name was Adrian, and he had been screwed over just as badly as I had, different circumstances, same betrayal. He had once been a rising fashion designer, working for a high-end boutique, until his so-called mentor stole his designs and took all the credit. With no connections and no money to fight back, he had been blacklisted from the industry. "You can either stay down, or you can build something better," he said. I chose the second option. "You should too." I studied him. "And what exactly are you building?" Adrian leaned forward, lowering his voice as if he was about to share a secret. "I'm starting my own clothing line. Small at first, custom streetwear, unique designs. No corporate middlemen. Just quality work and direct-to-customer sales." He watched me carefully, gauging my reaction. "You've got that look, you know. Like someone who's been in the system so long, they never thought about making their own rules." I stared at my nearly empty coffee cup, his words sinking in. He wasn't wrong. I had spent my entire life following my parents' blueprint for success, never once considering that I could make something of my own. "What's stopping you?" he asked. I exhaled slowly. "Money. Connections. A place to live." Adrian grinned. "Yeah, same here. But you've got something just as valuable: brains, discipline, and, from the way you carry yourself, a whole lot of repressed fury." I couldn't help but laugh. He wasn't wrong. That night, we sat in that dingy diner for hours, mapping out a plan. Adrian had the designs, but he needed someone with business sense. Someone who could help him scale, organize, and find a way to break into the market. And me? I had nothing to lose. By sunrise, we had a name. Havoc Clothing. A symbol of everything we had lost, and everything we were about to take back. I wasn't just going to survive. I was going to win. Starting a business with nothing but an idea and a shared sense of betrayal was the hardest thing I had ever done. But Adrian and I weren't just driven, we were desperate. And desperation is a hell of a motivator. We set up shop in the only place we could afford, an old, abandoned storage unit Adrian had managed to snag from a guy who owed him a favor. It wasn't much: cracked concrete floors, dim lighting, and a lingering smell of oil and dust, but it was ours. Adrian worked on the designs, pouring his talent into creating custom streetwear that blended high fashion with rebellion. Hoodies with intricate hand-painted details. Jackets with bold, unapologetic statements embroidered on the back. Every piece was a middle finger to the industry that had discarded him. Meanwhile, I did what I had always done best: strategize. I learned everything I could about online marketing, e-commerce, and brand building. I spent hours researching fashion trends, studying the psychology of what made a brand desirable. We couldn't afford traditional advertising, so I leaned into social media, crafting an aesthetic that screamed exclusivity and defiance. At first, no one cared. We had a website with no traffic, an Instagram page with barely any followers, and a bank account that was painfully empty. But I refused to give up. I started reaching out to small influencers, sending them free samples in exchange for exposure. I studied every successful underground brand and mimicked their growth tactics. I created scarcity, releasing only a limited number of designs at a time, making people want what they couldn't have. And then, one day, it happened. An influencer, someone with real clout, wore one of our jackets in a viral video. Our Instagram blew up overnight. Orders started flooding in, more than we could handle. We worked day and night, barely stopping to eat or sleep, printing, packaging, and shipping every order ourselves. We were exhausted, overworked. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't running on fear, I was running on adrenaline. Then came the first $10,000 month. Adrian and I stared at the numbers on my laptop, barely able to believe it. What started as an idea in a rundown diner was turning into something real. "Do you realize what this means?" Adrian said, shaking his head in disbelief. I nodded slowly. "Yeah, we're just getting started." The money was coming in. The brand was growing. And with every dollar we earned, with every new milestone we hit, one thought kept me going. My parents had thrown me away. And soon, they would realize just how big of a mistake they had made. The moment it happened, I barely had time to process it. I was sitting at my desk, no, not a desk, my office, going through our latest financial reports when I saw the number. At first, I thought I had misread it, but when I checked again, my breath caught in my throat. Revenue: $1,047,382. I blinked. Once, twice. My hands hovered over the keyboard, frozen. "Adrian," I called, my voice unsteady. He looked up from his latest design sketches, a cigarette dangling from his lips. "Yeah?" I turned the laptop screen toward him. He leaned in, scanning the numbers. Then he swore under his breath, yanking the cigarette from his mouth. "No. No way. We did it," I whispered. $1 million. We had made over $1 million. The past year had been a whirlwind. After that first viral moment, Havoc Clothing had taken off like wildfire. We couldn't keep up with demand. Every new collection sold out within hours. Celebrities started wearing our pieces, tagging us in posts that racked up millions of likes. The exclusivity of our brand made people need it. We had moved out of the storage unit and into a proper warehouse. Hired a small team. Expanded production. Every move was calculated, every decision strategic. And now, here we were. Adrian let out a wild laugh, slamming his hand on the desk. I told you we'd win." I exhaled slowly, feeling something I hadn't felt in years: power. Not the kind my parents had forced on me. Real power. The kind you earn. I had gone from sleeping on couches to running a 7-figure company in less than 2 years. And the best part? I had done it without them. I wasn't the failure they thought I was. I wasn't the disappointment they had cast aside. I was the storm they never saw coming. And soon, they would find out just how far I had risen. Success had tasted sweet, but revenge? That was going to be delicious. I had spent years rebuilding myself from nothing. The girl my parents had thrown away, the one they had deemed a failure, was gone. In her place stood a woman who had made over $1 million from her own company. A woman they had dismissed as worthless was now more successful than they could have ever imagined. And it was time for them to know it. The moment arrived in the most poetic way possible. One morning, my assistant forwarded me an email from a journalist writing an article on Havoc Clothing and its meteoric rise. It was a feature piece for a major financial magazine, and it just so happened that my father's company was also being covered in the same issue. The irony made me laugh. I didn't need to call them. I didn't need to announce anything. I knew that the moment the magazine hit newsstands, the moment my parents flipped through the glossy pages expecting to see their own success story, they would come face to face with mine instead. And I was right. 2 days after the article went live, my phone buzzed. Mom. I let it ring. Then came a second call. Dad. I leaned back in my leather office chair, watching my phone light up with notifications. Missed calls. Voicemails. Texts. The same parents who had kicked me out, humiliated me, told me I was a disgrace, were now desperate to reach me. Finally, I picked up on the third call, letting my voice remain perfectly cool. Hello? Claire, my mother's voice came through. Too bright, too fake. Darling, I just saw the article. How wonderful for you. We had no idea you were successful. I cut her off. Wealthy? Doing better than you ever imagined? A beat of silence. Then my father's voice, stern, yet laced with something else. Something I had never heard from him before. Uncertainty. Claire, we need to talk. Your mother and I feel that. I laughed. A real, full-bodied laugh. Now you want to talk? Claire, my mother started, her voice taking on that condescending tone I had known my whole life. Family is important. We've always supported you, and we just think. Stop, I said flatly. You kicked me out. You called me an embarrassment. You left me with nothing because I didn't live up to your standards. And now that I'm more successful than you ever dreamed, now I'm worth your time? That's not fair, my father snapped. We were trying to teach you responsibility. I let that sit for a moment. Then, calmly, I replied, you stole my future. So I'm going to take something from you. My mother's breath hitched. What do you mean? I smiled to myself. You'll find out soon enough. And then I hung up. Because my revenge wasn't just ignoring them. It wasn't just proving them wrong. It was going to be legal. Cold. Perfect. I had spent months gathering evidence, talking to lawyers, preparing my case. And now, I was ready. They had kicked me out for failing them. Now I was going to ruin them for failing me. Revenge isn't just about payback. It's about precision. It's about making sure that when the moment comes, there's nothing they can do to stop it. I had spent months preparing, gathering every piece of evidence I needed to destroy my parents in the one place they truly feared, a courtroom. With the help of my lawyer, I built a case against them. Wrongful eviction. Emotional distress. Unlawful financial manipulation. My parents hadn't just kicked me out, they had done it in a way that left me completely stranded, cutting me off from my own savings, refusing to offer any support. And in my state, that wasn't just cruel. It was illegal. When the lawsuit was officially filed, my parents' reaction was priceless. First came the calls. They were livid. My father's voice, once so measured and controlled, cracked with rage. My mother wailed about how I was tearing the family apart. Then came the threats. You think you can do this to us? We're your parents. I let them rant, let them scream. And when they were done, I simply said, see you in court. They tried everything to make it go away. Tried to manipulate me, guilt-trip me, even sent mutual family members to talk sense into me. But they had no power over me anymore. By the time we arrived at the courthouse, my parents looked like ghosts of the people they once were. My mother, usually so polished, had dark circles under her eyes. My father's confidence had cracked into something more fragile. They weren't just afraid of losing, they were afraid of me. The trial was brutal. My lawyer presented evidence that made it clear they had thrown their daughter onto the street without a second thought. They had denied me access to financial resources that legally belonged to me. They had caused intentional emotional and financial harm. I sat there, calm and composed, watching as my parents squirmed under cross-examination. Watching as my father stammered through explanations, as my mother tried to play the victim only to be dismantled by my lawyer's questioning. When the verdict came, I felt nothing but satisfaction. They lost. The court ordered them to pay me a massive financial settlement, far more than they had ever spent trying to craft my perfect future. They were forced to sell off assets, downsize their extravagant lifestyle, and worst of all, they had no way to stop it. As I walked out of the courtroom, my mother grabbed my wrist. "Claire," she whispered, tears in her eyes. "Please, don't do this. We're still your parents." I looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time in my life, I felt nothing. No sadness, no guilt. Just cold certainty. "You were my parents," I said quietly. "But the moment you threw me away, you stopped being my family." Then I pulled my wrist free and walked away, leaving them behind, just like they had once done to me. But I wasn't done yet. I had one more thing left to do. One final move to make sure they never forgot what they had lost. Winning the lawsuit was satisfying, but I wasn't done. My parents had taught me that success was everything, that reputation was more valuable than love. So, my final move wasn't just about taking their money. It was about taking their name. After the court ruling, news of the case spread like wildfire. A wealthy couple disowning their daughter for not getting into university, then losing everything because of it? It was the kind of scandal people devoured. The financial magazine that had originally covered my success followed up with an even bigger headline. "Thrown out and thriving, how Claire Harrington built a $1 million empire after her own parents kicked her to the curb." It went viral. I watched with cold satisfaction as my parents' carefully crafted social standing crumbled overnight. Clients of my father's firm started pulling out. My mother's charity circles whispered behind her back, no longer inviting her to their luncheons. Their friends, the ones they had once bragged to about their perfect daughter, stopped returning their calls. Their downfall was public. Brutal. And worst of all, they had no control over it. I didn't hear from them for weeks after the ruling. Then, one evening, my phone rang. Unknown number. I answered, already knowing who it would be. "Claire." My father's voice was low, defeated. I could hear my mother in the background, softly crying. "You've made your point." I leaned back in my chair, glancing around my penthouse apartment, the one I had bought with my own money. The view of the city skyline stretched before me, a testament to everything I had built, everything they had denied me. "No," I said, my voice steady. "I don't think I have." He sighed. "We've lost everything." I smiled to myself. "Now you know how it feels." A long silence stretched between us. Then, carefully, as if he hated the words coming out of his mouth, he said, "Maybe we can start over. As a family." I almost laughed. After everything, after throwing me out like garbage, after years of manipulation, now they wanted to play the role of loving parents? "No," I said simply. "That's not going to happen. Claire." "I don't need you," I cut him off. "I never did. And now, you don't have me." For the first time in my life, I had the power. And I was using it to do what they had never expected. I was walking away. Before he could respond, I hung up, blocking the number for good. Then I opened my laptop and finalized something I had been considering for weeks. I was legally changing my last name. No longer would I be tied to the people who had abandoned me. No longer would I carry the name of those who saw me as nothing more than an extension of their own success. When the paperwork was signed, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. I had built my own life. My own name. My own legacy. I had one. And they? They would spend the rest of their lives knowing that the daughter they threw away became more powerful, more successful, and more untouchable than they had ever dreamed. Justice had never felt so good.